To answer questions about why he and the suspended SARS Commissioner, Tom Moyane, concluded that the establishment of the so-called rogue unit within SARS was illegal. Lebelo was speaking at the SARS Commission of Inquiry led by retired Judge Bob Nugent. Of course, in recent years, SARS has faced criticism around lower than expected revenue collection, delayed refunds, claims of corruption. President Ramaphosa suspended Moyane in March ahead of a disciplinary inquiry. He appointed the commission to look into all things tax in May. To discuss, we're joined by journalist for Scorpio, the investigative arm of the Daily Maverick, Pauli van Wyk, and she joins us on Skype. Thank you for being with us. Pauli, the man who is testifying, Luther Lebelo, has been called one of Tom Moyane's hitmen before. Is that fair?
Yes, it's definitely fair. Good evening. So today, Mr. Luther Lebelo at the Commission of Inquiry into SARS said that he didn't do anything, that he knew nothing, that nothing ever went wrong where he was involved in. But we know that that is nonsense, especially if you go back in the history of on his own words. If you go and look at what he said on radio stations, on TV stations, to the SABC, you will realize that Mr. Luther Lebelo was not telling the whole truth. He ingratiated himself with every commissioner, before where he worked at, so including Mr. Tom Moyane and now Mr. Mark Kingan. He was involved in many labor relation decisions. He leaked private HR or human resources documents of Ivan Pillay to the commission and to the media. And then SARS would tend to start reacting on these documents. So Mr. Luther Lebelo he struggled to explain his role. He couldn't really say why Mr. Ivan Pillay, who was at the time in 2014 the deputy commissioner of SARS, why he was actually hounded and why he was suspended. So he struggled to answer the commission's questions, and the reason for that is that he just couldn't, because he was so involved in what Mr. Moyane had done at the time. There was many times that he defended the rogue unit narrative. Today he said he had no evidence of a rogue unit. He had never heard of any equipment that this unit had, and yet he fought with journalists like me and Business Day's journalists and Beeld and so on at the time when we tried to make sense of what was happening. He would fight with us and say, that we're wrong and biased. And today it did come out that he was just lying about a lot of things.
And this is so important, because people were suspended, people were fired over the rogue unit. He's an HR exec. Tom Moyane laid a charge, and Pravin Gordhan himself was also pursued by the Hawks. So now there's suddenly no explanation.
Yes, exactly. And doesn't that sound strange for someone that was so involved, that was actually used as Mr. Tom Moyane's right-hand man, and suddenly the same man says, you know what, I actually did nothing wrong, I knew nothing, and I wasn't really involved.
Does this testimony add to the belief that these charges around the rogue unit were being trumped up, maybe specifically to go after Gordhan?
So if you look at especially the evidence, documentary evidence, not necessarily only what people said, it's clear that Mr. Gordhan was targeted when you looked at the evidence laid before the authorities. Mr. Gordhan was sort of on the periphery of certain decisions, and they tried to make a direct link to Mr. Gordhan. And it was clear at the time, remember this was 2016, and it was a difficult time in our history. It was a difficult time where state capture was really fighting to keep its grip. So yes, indeed, it does show that.
So others have spoken about an atmosphere of fear under Moyane. Tell us about the testimony of Yusuf, I can't remember his surname, the fraud investigator, Yusuf Danath, and others today.
Yeah, Yusuf Danath is one of the investigators that looked at internal fraud at SARS, and some very important and very wealthy and dynamic circles that operated within the country that would corrupt SARS officials and people sort of trying to defraud the taxman. Now, Yusuf, as well as a lot of other SARS people, testified how they were bullied, how they were hounded, how illegal charges were proffered against them, how charges without any basis were sort of cooked up against them, and how this created some fear. I think one of the things that we heard at the time, about a month or so ago, was how trees were uprooted, and how cameras were instituted or installed even on copy machines. So SARS people said that they couldn't understand, they didn't know what was happening. There's never been this culture where you weren't allowed to speak your mind or weren't allowed to test a certain viewpoint. And suddenly, under Mr. Moyane's reign, it became a big sin to speak your mind. You would easily be written out of the SARS operating model or the SARS human resources structure, or you would just be sidelined or pushed to resign.
Is the evidence piling up here, I guess in a nutshell, that under Tom Moyane, SARS became a shadow of its former self?
Yes, indeed. So if you look at the numbers, we analyzed the numbers over a 7-year trend, and you can see how, for example, the illicit trade in tobacco and alcohol has dipped. You can see how the revenue from that it didn't come into SARS. So it shows clearly that the tobacco companies are making a killing, that they are not paying their dues, that they've grown, and their dues to SARS has decreased very steeply. So that in the one sector shows you that the numbers are decreasing. And then it shows also further that when you look at criminal investigations like Mr. Robert Huang, Mr. Mark Liffman, the Guptas. So in the enforcement capacity, there was also big problems because these people weren't prosecuted anymore. Very serious and criminal cases weren't initiated. It wasn't investigated. And these people to this day either have big, claims against them, or they had big settlements arranged by Mr. Moyane for them, or sort of these investigations were just stalled. With the Guptas particularly, we know that the investigations there actually never got off the ground. The investigations were initiated in Mr. Ivan Pilley's time, and then it just never, it was just never further investigated and sort of developed into proper investigations. So,
but the motive here is important. Can this be bad management, or is there any evidence that Tom Moyane was in bed with cigarette smugglers or other equally dubious characters?
That's such a good question. So just to answer that, and let's take a step back. So if you look at every sort of sector or every theme, it makes you wonder, it makes you frown. And you think something's wrong here. They're disbanding the enforcement or the criminal investigations capacity. They sort of fragment the reporting lines. They are pushing out people that has worked decades in SARS. So all these things makes you wonder what happened. But if you put everything together, it creates a mosaic picture that shows you that it's not bad management. It's actually planned and premeditated. And we know that, for example, because Mr. Moyane met with then President Jacob Zuma in around 2013. Then he met with Bain's Sub-Saharan African director, Mr. Victorio Mazzoni, months before he would become the SARS commissioner. So he then discusses, how would you change SARS? Give me advice. And then when he gets appointed in September 2014, he ensures that Bain gets the tender, a tender that's totally rigged, and lots of red flags must have been gone up, but it just didn't. So Bain gets this tender, and they change SARS in a way that's totally detrimental, that decimates the investigative capacity, that fragments reporting lines, and that makes it, in essence, less effective. Now, if you look at that whole picture and you look at how Mr. Ivan Pillay and Mr. Pieter Engelbrecht and Mr. Yusuf de Nuff and Mrs. Ronel van Wyk, those people were really good people, good investigators, how they were pushed out, it shows you a picture that it's not by accident, it's not bad management, it was planned and it was premeditated.
All right, so the evidence stacking up. Thank you for your insightful analysis. That was journalist for Scorpio, the investigative arm of the Daily Maverick, Pauli van Wyk. And of course, we'll continue to follow all the testimony at the SARS Commission of Inquiry.